Hello, everybody, and this is, I believe, now take three. Due to the total disaster of the previous attempts at this, I am beginning again, and I apologize to everybody who tried the first two versions of this. What happened was I tried to do the stream through what appeared to be an all singing, all dancing uh, streaming platform, which I thought would be useful, and it turned out that it was. I think the fairest way I can put it is a complete and utter fucking disaster. So I again apologize to anybody who tuned in for the first and second attempt at this. It did not go well, and needless to say, the subscription I'd taken out to that particular service has been junked. So we're back on the old reliable Rumble studio today. Forgive the green curtain in the background. This is due to trying to use a fake background on the old service, and that did not come off, of course, in the slightest. So we will get right into it. As I said on take two of this particular stream or attempt at a stream. What we're going to be looking at is the nature of capitalism in Russia and the question, of course, the perennial question over the last 3 years, which is that is this an imperialist nation? Now, I'm going to recapitulate some of the points I made on the previous attempt at this, and we're going to do so in a way that sums up, and perhaps too quickly, but I will attempt to move with brevity on this one. The work that Lenin did in 1916 in his work Imperialism, the High Stage of Capitalism, where he's analyzing imperialism, or should we say, uh, corrupt and decadent and decaying monopoly capitalism, in its, if not in its infancy, then certainly at its earliest point of mass conflagration, being World War One. And what is monopoly capitalism? Monopoly capitalism, of course, the product of the end of the period of free competition, and it emerges in Britain, France, the unified Germany, the unified United States after the Civil War, and it emerges with the coming together of industrial capital and money capital into forming finance capital. And this happens when the industrial concerns get larger and larger through mergers and acquisitions, elimination of competition, consolidation into monopolies, and or a, or a series of monopolies. And the merger with money capital comes about through the need of those who control the industrial capital for access to more and more credit, for access to more and more sources of finance, in order that they can adequately cover the costs of business expansion and also of revolutionizing the means of production. You see, there is a certain point that is reached in the development of industrial capitalism in the later 19th century, where there is a very high level of productivity and an increasingly high level of automation in the production process. If not automation, then the elimination of skilled work and its replacement with unskilled work. And what the capitalist class finds in the later 19th century is that they have advanced to the point where they are making as much money as they can, so they think, from the employment of labor in their country of origin, Britain, France, Germany, United States, etc., but especially Britain, being the oldest capitalist power, reaches the point where they obtained a certain level of productivity, but also they saw the profitability of employing labor domestically to dip and dip. In order to maintain a higher level of profit, they needed to go and get production done elsewhere in the world. And this, what spurs this on, of course, is the emergence of finance capital, which pushes capitalism towards the export not of commodities, but of actual capital itself. Capital taken to the rest of the world um, in the case of Britain, to the British colonies, in order that they can make a higher rate of return, employing the labor of Indians, Nigerians, black South Africans, etc., rather than the Kentish men, or Essex men, or anybody else from the British homeland. So this is, as Lenin observes in Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. You get to this stage where um, where capital is now looking to export itself into the colonial world, and it is this which causes the competition for colonies, known as the Scramble for Africa, because suddenly you have Britain, France, the unified Germany, Italy, then, which had also unified, all competing for colonies in Africa. Why? Because they all suddenly had the same problem. They all suddenly needed to export capital in order to make the highest rate of return possible, to make the highest profits possible. And how do you export capital to areas of the world that you've been shut out of? Well, it's very hard to do that. And so you need as many areas of the world under your control or under your influence as possible in that state, in that time, in order that you can have unfiltered access, or unfettered access to the sources of labor there that you can exploit, and to the markets that you can muscle your way into and dominate. And that's what the British were doing with, and the others too, in the race to control the land of the African peoples, and also to expand their influence in other areas of the world. For instance, Lenin mentions in Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, how the British, the French, and the US were all competing with each other to dominate the banking systems of the South American nations. And again, that's a process which goes on to this day. But the reason why I'm going through this is because what defines imperialism in that time, and which still defines imperialism to this day, is of course the coming together of money capital, industrial capital to make finance capital, the emergence of these gigantic monopolies on the world stage, which are more and more concerned with the export of capital rather than commodities, and of course the gigantic and outsized role of the banking system, and the merger of all of this, the merger of this monopoly capital with the state machine. Now, to go back over where the Russian bourgeoisie of today and where they came from, because of course the Russian bourgeoisie of Lenin's time were of course enthusiastic to get involved in imperialism. They were enthusiastic at getting hold of land acquisitions in the declining and falling Ottoman Empire. And that's, of course, a big part of the reason why they got involved in World War One. Now, the Russian bourgeois of today is every bit as decadent and every bit as much of a dead end as the Russian bourgeois of back then was. But the difference being that this bourgeoisie grew up inside the old Soviet states, and they came principally from three places. They came from within the CPSU itself. A lot of them came from the Komsomol, which had been used, or a big faction of it had been used to develop pro-bourgeois elements from really the period of the mid 60s onwards, of the later Khrushchev and early Brezhnev period. Saw the Komsomol adopt a lot of like pro-bourgeois policies and positions, and a significant faction of them came to be incredibly, very strongly pro-capitalist. And it was from out of there that people like Dmitry Medvedev came. He was a Komsomol member. Many of those who came to be known as the oligarchs in Ukraine and Russia came out of that Komsomol period, Komsomol from the late 80s, because what they had was a lot of resources, access to party funds, and they were given the right by the Gorbachevites to start their own businesses, and were able to use all these connections they built up as budding party members of the youth wing to exploit that, to build in them those connections into business connections to make fortunes in the 1990s. The other part of the Russian bourgeoisie comes from the old industrial management side. So guys who used to run factories, who used to run collective farms, who again traded on their connections and their expertise to seize control of a lot of state assets in the late 80s and particularly the 1990s. The other bit of the Russian bourgeoisie, of course, that is very famous and infamous, is of course the pure criminal part of it. Those who were black marketeers, who were smuggling stuff both into the Soviet Union and out of it, who were dominated what was called the shadow economy during the 60s, 70s, and 80s in particular. Many of whom were perpetual jailbirds who were frequently sent to prison for corrupt dealings in the Brezhnev and the Andropov era. And again, they were let off the leash in the Gorbachev era. So you have a Russian bourgeois which comes out of the party, the state and industrial management side, and the criminal side. And you had those within that bourgeois who more than likely were members of all three at various different times, or members of all three groups at the same time. Now, the oligarchs all came out of this. These were people who, again, traded upon their connections with the party and the state and the criminal world to seize control of certain key assets. Now, a lot of them, people like Boris Berezovsky, were more concerned with things with like media enterprises. People like Roman Abramovich, who was involved with, of course, Chelsea Football Club for a while. He was in the oil business, and again, he was more from the sort of criminal side of things. Now, what happens in the 90s is that this proto-bourgeois, which grows into a capitalist class, which runs the Yeltsin administration, looks to make money as quickly as possible. They're also looking to destabilize the Soviet proletariat and then the Russian proletariat to make sure that there isn't a return to socialism, that the proletariat does not rise up against them. So how do they do that? Well, they look to secure themselves a place in the world market as quickly as possible, whilst also asset stripping Russian industry, sacking many workers, making sure that whole industries are destroyed by being asset stripped and closed down. That's the quickest way to get a fast return on it. And also by mortgaging the country to the United States, the British, and others. Excuse me. The comprador element in Russia comes out of the fact that significant elements of this bourgeoisie in the 1990s came to profit directly from the sale of Russian resources, particularly raw resources, oil and gas in particular, into the world market, a world market dominated by the US and the British and the Europeans. Now, comprador bourgeoisie is typically thought of as those bourgeois elements who are tied into business arrangements with imperialist powers who have a direct interest in keeping the country subjugated. Now, the Russian bourgeoisie in the 90s, given that those of them who weren't involved in like media and things like that, the great bulk of them, like Mikhail Khodorkovsky, were invested heavily in the oil business. The oil and gas business didn't get asset stripped and destroyed anything like the rest of Russian industry did. So if you like look at, for instance, Russian aircraft manufacturing, a huge industrial concern in the Soviet period, produced some very fine aircraft and was destroyed in the 2000s, as Putin himself has admitted to, by the opening up of these, by the destruction of the means of production of Russian aircraft. Military side of it survived. Civilian aviation got decimated. Machine tools as well was an industrial sector that was decimated by foreign competition, and quite deliberately so. Now, what did the imperialists want? The imperialists wanted a Russia that was able to extract oil, but was only able to extract oil on terms dictated by the imperialists. And so what they wanted was Russian workers to, of course, drill and extract the oil and the gas, but they wanted the machinery to be built in the West. They wanted the spare parts to be built in the West. They wanted as much control over the extraction process as possible. And they also wanted to make sure that Russia remained simply a raw resource appendage of the West, meaning that the imperialists were opposed to the redevelopment of Russia as an industrial power. If Russia had remained a the raw resource appendage that the imperialists wanted it to, we wouldn't be having this problem that is the war in Ukraine right now, because the imperialists would be perfectly happy with Russia remaining under the control of the, sort of a Yeltsinite system and remaining underdeveloped and able to be hyper exploited. So what happens to put this Yeltsinite system down, though? Because this is indeed how we get the rise of Putin. So the Yeltsinite system collapses basically under the weight of the economic crisis of 1998, where it gets so bad that Yeltsin, who's only won a re-election, by the way, in an election now everybody acknowledges was rigged against Gennady Zyuganov, the KPRF challenger. Yeltsin's only been in 2 years after his re-election, a fake re-election, and the economy completely collapses in 1998, and it looks like it's going to spiral all the way to potential state collapse or a resurgence of revolutionary action on behalf of the Russian proletariat. So suddenly the knees are cut off the compradors who have dominated the Russian politics of the 1990s, and this is compounded by the fact that Yeltsin, clearly and obviously under the influence of the comprador bourgeoisie, sells out to the US with regard to selling out Milosevic over Kosovo. See our recent Decline and Fall editions for a look back over the Kosovo War and the imperialists' role within it. But to go back to the point about who's in charge in Russia at this time, it is those like Khodorkovsky who are directly tied into the sale of Russian oil and gas to the imperialists. And to get favorable terms from the imperialists, who, of course, has to dance to the tune that they are playing for him, meaning that they will buy the oil and gas, but they will do so in such a way as it favors their interests. They don't want the sale of oil and gas to facilitate a Russian industrial revival. They don't want a Russian leadership which is capable of putting up any resistance against the ripping off of the country by imperialism. And they don't want a Russia that is able to become independent again. That's what they don't want. Remember, Russia was to be treated like a neo-colony. And as we know from reading on Krummer, a neo-colony has to be kept underdeveloped. And that's the point. Underdevelopment. So for the comprador bourgeoisie, they have an interest in selling Russian resources, selling them to the imperialists and pocketing the profits. They have no real interest in reinvesting in the businesses that they wish to control. They only have an interest in getting the resources out of the ground as quickly as possible and selling them to US, British, French, German companies. And that's the model that's there under the late Yeltsin administration. Yeltsin's administration is destroyed by a combination of economic disaster and then the sellout over Yugoslavia, a sellout which was so craven and obvious that even elements that had previously put up with him turned against him. Now, prior to Yeltsin being forced out completely, you have a coalition government being brought in under Yevgeny Primakov, which included two communist ministers. This is how bad it was. Yeltsin had been forced to concede to having the KPRF in a coalition government for a while. He eventually sacks Primakov, but not before the damage is already done. And Yeltsin is forced out in later 1999, early 2000, and you get the emergence of first Putin as prime minister. Yeltsin resigns before his term is up, and then Putin emerges as president. Now, what creates the Putin system, and it is, as we'll come to, a Bonapartist system, is the weakness and the comparative weakness of all the different classes within Russia in the late 90s. So the proletariat is still suffering from the horrendous defeat of 1989 to 91. Though the KPRF is present, I think it's pretty fair to say that its leadership at the time was not pursuing a revolutionary position. The vanguard of the Russian working class was very weak. The working class was very divided. There was still a lot of pro-capitalist elements within the working class. Even with all the disasters that had taken place, there were still some higher paid workers who remained pro-capitalist. So whilst there was a lot of anger and a lot of rage and a lot of wishes to restore the Soviet system, the working class was by no means unified, and it didn't have the level of leadership required to lead what would have needed to be a war against the comprador bourgeoisie. However, the comprador bourgeoisie themselves were incredibly weak. They'd led the country to a complete and utter collapse, a disaster, a humiliation, uh, being dominated by the imperialists, and meant that the weakness of the comprador bourgeoisie and the large scale opposition to them, but inability to coalesce behind a revolutionary line within the Russian proletariat led to chaos and confusion and the total corruption of the state and the purchasing of it in its officials by the Russian bourgeoisie led to a sort of a jam by the late 1999 2000, whereby the Russian state was becoming too enfeebled to enforce its writ, and even some elements of the bourgeoisie started to see that if things continued this way, then their own interests would be threatened. This is why you get the Putin system. The Putin system is able to grow, made up mainly of old KGB era security men, like Putin himself, who emerge as a Bonapartist force within Russia, which is there to secure the stability of the state. And because the contending classes are weak in terms of their ability to organize, the Putin system is able to elevate itself um, to a certain degree above the classes in Russia, even though it's still a pro-capitalist government. But within the Putin-led system, there is a recognition that the various elements in the bourgeoisie needed to be reined in, and they are reined in over the course of the first few years. So let's return to the question of, is the Russian bourgeoisie imperialist? Absolutely not. And it's absolutely not imperialist because look at how chronically weak it is. Now, the imperialist powers of the late 19th century got to the point where they were exporting capital rather than commodities because they'd reached a certain degree of productivity and efficiency within, like Britain, within France, within Germany, within the United States, that essentially it took them to the point where they realized that if they wanted to actually make higher and higher profits, that what they had to do was to export capital, not commodities anymore. Through the contradictory, that capitalism is such a contradictory beast that the more productive it becomes, its level of productivity can actually become a threat to the amount of profit you can make, which is why you go from a highly productive industry to a collapse. And what you have is it is because of the sheer success and the merging together of all these different companies into becoming these giant monopolies that it reaches the point where it has to be about the export of capital rather than commodities. Now, what is the Russian bourgeoisie doing? Are they exporting capital? Only in the sense of that they're sending money that they've looted from the Soviet era, Soviet era factories, which they've asset stripped and closed down, and they're taking their ill-gotten gains out of the country to places like banks in Cyprus, banks in the City of London, banks on Wall Street, Paris, Germany, etc. That's not the same as exporting capital to a colony or a neo-colony for the purposes of setting up either the extraction of resources or the production of commodities there to employ labor on much cheaper terms than you can in the homeland. So these are two different things we're looking at here. The Russian bourgeoisie sends money that it's largely acquired by very dubious methods to banks overseas. It's not going overall. It is not going to places where it can have the same relationships that the British had with the Indian proletariat or the Nigerian proletariat, for example. Now, some might argue that the Russian bourgeoisie exploits labor in like Central Asia, places like that, and there are elements of that there. But again, Russia doesn't act as an imperialist power with regard to the Central Asian countries. The Central Asian countries do have problems with imperialism. It generally comes from the generally comes from their relationship with Britain, with the United States, etc., etc. So there are imperialist powers in the Central Asian nations. It's just that the Russians aren't really one of them. So the when you look at like the level of industrial development in Russia, right up to the present day, now the Putin system takes certain measures to stabilize the economic situation and stop the continued deindustrialization of Russia. Funnily enough, as soon as Putin does this in 2003, and as soon as he asserts the control of the state slightly over the Russian ruling class, that's when you start to get the screams from the imperialists about how Putin is building a tyranny. And of course, the first prominent pro-Western oligarch to face the chopping block is, of course, our old friend Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who's charged with tax evasion and tax fraud, which, of course, crimes which I would say he is most probably guilty, or was most probably guilty. Um, others were guilty of them too, but they stuck to the deal that Putin offered them in the early 2000s, which is stop trying to buy control of the state, stay out of direct politics, and you can keep all the things you stole in the 90s. Many of them took that deal. Khodorkovsky, due to, I think, his interests being in being a tool of imperialism, couldn't take that deal, and also the man obviously clearly had an enormous ego and thought he should be Russian president as well. Point being that the Russian ruling class at each stage after the emergence of Putin, this is not a ruling class which is strong. It's a ruling class which has stolen a lot, but it is not a ruling class that's been able to actually develop itself to the point where it can embark on the imperialist path. No, what they're interested in is continuing to act as a resource appendage of the West and continue to steal as much money as possible. Those are the things they're interested in. They're not interested in doing anything else. And here we get to the point about the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine, condemned by like the KKE and others as an imperialist acts on behalf of the Russian Federation. The war in Ukraine came about because of course, the actions of the U.S. imperialists in turning Ukraine into a militarized neo-colony under the control of themselves and the British, which would act as a battering ram against the Russian Federation. Not my words, but certainly the intention behind certain policy papers published by the Rand Corporation, particularly the one that deals with the need to, as they put it, unbalance Russia. And the way in which the Russian bourgeoisie responded to the various aggressive moves taken by the imperialists in Ukraine is telling. The biggest sources of opposition to the taking of military action to secure Crimea in 2014, and then to the special military operation in 2022, came their ultimate source was the most most hardcore comprador elements in the Russian bourgeoisie. And it was towards them, of course, that the sanctions regime of the U.S. imperialists and the British and the Europeans was targeted. It was what they were doing was they were cutting off the access of the comprador bourgeoisie, who depend on access to Western capital and Western markets. They were cutting them off from these and trying to make it the case that they would be able to essentially then motivate by attacking their bank accounts directly, the Russian comprador bourgeoisie to carry out some kind of color revolution and or coup against Putin and against the wider Putin-led system. This is what the aim of the sanctions ultimately was. The Western imperialists who constructed the sanctions regime looked at things in such a way as to identify what they thought were the weaknesses in the Russian system. They saw the weaknesses in the Russian system being the dominance of the comprador bourgeoisie, and they thought that what they could do was by applying pressure to them, they could then push them into coming out into the open and organizing some sort of coup against Putin. What they underestimated was the fact that since 2001, 2002, the strongest comprador elements, meaning the most hardcore elements that are tied to the US and British imperialism, they've been systematically weakened. The control of the state, the Russian state, has been extended over certain key economic areas, particularly energy, and the control of the state has been extended over the banking industry. So whereas the banks in the period of imperialism, say for instance in Britain or France or Germany, back over 100 years ago, played this massive role, which merged with the state due to the fact that they had become so large and their interests so all-encompassing. What you have in Russia in the 90s and the 2000s is almost the opposite of that. You have a weak bourgeoisie, which is in charge of many, many corrupt banks, most of which seems to be dedicated to laundering money to get it, again, out of the country and stashed elsewhere. What the Russian government does over the last decade or so is drastically slim down the number of banks and assert state control over all of them. So what you have is this Bonapartist, though still capitalist system, slowly taking more and more control over the different elements in the Russian banking system and different elements of Russian industry in order to stop it collapsing, in order to sort it out, even though it's still being run on a pro-capitalist basis, in order to stabilize it, which is what the Putin system has really always been about, which is stabilizing, then cautiously advancing in terms of industrial development, banking development, etc., military developments. And what the Putin system also represents is this sort of balancing between these different interests, balancing between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, between different elements in the bourgeoisie, different contrasted with different elements in the proletariat, which is the classic Bonapartist approach, which is to elevate the state above uh, the dynamics of the class struggle to a degree, in order to force outcomes on the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Now, again, the Russian bourgeoisie still has a sizable influence within the Putin system, but it doesn't completely dominate it. And so, like I said, when you look at the development of either industry or banking, what you see is not that Russian bourgeoisie turns to becoming imperialist because they reached this strong point of industrial development and therefore needed to essentially start exporting capital to continue to reap super profits. What you have is a weak and corrupt bourgeoisie, which is forced to play a subordinated role by a Bonapartist system because it had essentially run the country into the ground by the end of the 1990s and needed to be rescued from almost destroying itself. And the Russian bourgeoisie has remained a weak and feeble creation ever since. And the Russian economy started to move only in a more serious way after these people, after this class, had at least some of its power taken away from it. And also the Russian state resumed a role as people like academics like Richard Connolly have researched. The Russian state resumed a role in industrial planning and development that it had abandoned in the 1990s. And added to this, you have shifts in the dynamics in Russia, which is that the Communist Party of the Russian Federation's understanding of what had happened in the 90s and the 2000s actually seems to become more popular in Russia, and the newer generation starts to actually reject some, if not most now, of the anti-communist lies told by Khrushchev, Gorbachev, Yeltsin, etc. And you start to see things like the restoration of the reputation of Stalin, etc. None of this would be the choice of the Russian bourgeoisie, nor would the war have been the choice of the Russian bourgeoisie. They've always been looking for a way out, which is what, again, the calculations of the Trump administration and the British are based on the idea that there's this bourgeois element in there that desperately wants a deal at any cost. Now, they're right to make that calculation because those elements do exist, but they are counterbalanced by strong elements within the state itself, which are opposed to deal with imperialism, and very strong elements within the Russian proletariat, which are opposed to a deal with imperialism, certainly opposed to a sellout deal with imperialism. So to go out back to the point, like, how can it be that why should we regard Russia as an imperialist power when the class that it represents imperialism, that pushes imperialism into existence in its modern form, which is the bourgeoisie, they are the ones which who are not concerned with the development of Russian industry. In fact, have opposed it. Who have retained many of them at least a comprador relationship with the West, who are the shakiest, even the supposedly national bourgeoisie, are the shakiest and most unreliable allies in terms of the pursuit of the special military operation, who are always looking for a way to sell out and capitulate to the West in order that they can, if only the West would respect their interests on a national basis. So that's not an imperialist power, nor is the fact that Russia participates in a world market dominated by the United States make it an imperialist power either, as some so-called communists have suggested. What you're seeing in Russia is it's not a completely unique formation, but it's a very distinctive formation where you have this Bonapartist system, which is able to come into existence because of the weakness and the weak and chaotic nature of the Russian bourgeoisie, and the lack of a militant leadership of the Russian working class in the late 90s, and the comparatively weak level of class struggle that was going on, but with the added element of extreme fragmentation due to economic and societal disintegration, thanks to the crisis of the 1990s, which brings into existence the Putin-led system based on the personnel of what's generally called the securocrat complex, meaning Putin and others from the Russian intelligence services and military step forward to take control of the state and stop its disintegration. None of that points to a powerful imperialist bourgeoisie, which is hungry for conquests. What it points to is a weak bourgeoisie, which is forced into a subordinate role in a Bonapartist system just to survive, and has to have industries taken off its hands, taken away from it, in order that they can be developed, because the Russian bourgeoisie is just incapable of serious industrial development, as it's shown all the way through the last 20 years. So for all of those reasons, when Lenin's talking about the development of imperialism, and you apply that analysis to Russia in the late 90s and the 2000s up to now, the if you try and assess whether Russia is an imperialist power by the terms and mode of analysis outlined by Lenin, then that's just not going to be the case. That it's that you're able to call this an imperialist country. It just simply is not. And the way in which that certain people try to play with or sort of distort Lenin's analysis to prove that a square can be a circle, etc., just shows that by mindlessly repeating phrases, you can certainly win an argument on the internet, but you don't necessarily prove anything in the real world. So I'm just going to pause there for a second, and I'll be back with you in just a moment. Right, back again. Finally got this on the road. Should have just stuck with Rumble Studio in the first place. So again, glad that you could all join me. Going to go for questions now. And as I said on the unsuccessful stream, there's a really good investigation done by the German comrades at the Communist Organization, which I would encourage everybody to read in full. It's a very good exploration of the nature of compradorism inside Russia. So, what have we got in terms of comments tonight? We have Gonzalo Cabrera, good evening to you. Carter Mann, who's again asking for a program on Deng Xiaoping. Well, that could come about, but I will need to do a lot significantly more research on that. So, hello to Steve Choke from Ringgold, Georgia. Hello to Daniel, who's celebrating the apparently slow death of Joe Biden. Now, if ever a man deserved time to reflect upon his sins, it's certainly him. Hello to Mogman Dog. Good morning to Ash, and down there on the other end of the world. Hello to Oromus, who joined us from the once and future Socialist Republic of Lithuania. Hello to James Graham. Hello to Jerry. Hello to Bishi. Hello to Seth Stuff. Hello to Why I Ain't Cool over on Twitch. Hello to Comrade Davey. Hello to Irish Partisan. Hello to Jenny. And to who else we got here? Jimmy Timmy. Have you watched the Chinese documentary on how and why the USSR collapsed? I have got it on my computer. I'm going to be looking at it at some point, probably tomorrow. Hello to Spurious Furious. Hello to Sid Hatfield, Slumbering Colossus, Arcane Eclectic. Um, who else we got here? Caustic Grip. Who raises the question of whether India is an imperialist power these days. I would say no, but that will take a lot of investigation on my part. So I'm going to say provisionally no. I don't think they are, but again, I'll have to do a very serious investigation into that and see if any material's been produced on that by like Indian Marxists or anybody else that I can draw on to do a program on that. So, right, who else we got here? Ash says Indian bourgeoisie does have imperialist ambitions, but is stifled by its lack of investments in its own infrastructure. Yeah. Um, you don't get to become an imperialist just by wishing it was so, you know. Would we call Israel an outpost, an imperialist power, an entity with expansionist tendencies, or an outpost of imperialism? They can't exist without the US. Like Israel doesn't play an independent role in the world, as we've argued here many times. Everything they do because the US tolerates it or the US wants it. The US doesn't want it to do something; it doesn't do something. It's as simple as that. The US tells it to go where to go and what to do. Um, the There are contradictions within that, of course. There always are, but the Israel is not capable of being an imperialist power in its own right. It is an outpost of principally US, but also British imperialism. N. Minkowski says a whole bunch of Russian prominent YouTube leftists, Karglitsky, Kalganov, to name a few, insist Russia is imperialist and both are worse in the war with Ukraine. Astounding. Well, these people are not worthy of much consideration. I can probably do like several shows just going through how wrong they were. But I mean, if you read the opinion of the KPRF, if you read the opinion of Professor Popov's organization, who is who affects a more militant language in the KPRF, they all come to the same conclusion that like Russian capitalism is just like it is too feeble and it is too stunted to actually reach the level of becoming an imperialist power. It's more stunted and feeble even than the pre-1917 Russian bourgeois, and that says quite a lot. So the Russian bourgeoisie knows how to steal from Russians, but it's Russians themselves, the Russian proletariat, who are the principal victims of the Russian bourgeoisie, and the Russian bourgeoisie can barely even build anything. I mean, for whatever one might say about the German bourgeois prior to 1914 or the French bourgeois, they did at least develop their countries to the point where they were industrialized powers with a very impressive selection of infrastructure and a very high degree of productivity of labor. You just simply can't argue that about the Russian bourgeoisie at all. What else we got here? So hello to Michael McGoldrick. Hello to Aziz, Paddy, Chris Casseroles, Caustic Grip, etc. So it's a relatively short one tonight due to the rather truncated nature of things. I say again, I apologize for the colossal failure that took place earlier. I will be returning to this subject because, again, it's a very interesting one. It merits further discussion over who is and who isn't imperialist power. My contention is still the fact that the imperialist powers are still found within the G7 nations, and that these haven't been added to. Not really. Um, so I'll bring things to a close for tonight. I'll be back with you tomorrow, hopefully with less technical fuck ups. Thanks to everybody for their patience. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. I'll be back with you again tomorrow. But until then, thank you for watching.